Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another MLFL. This week, we are very excited to host Kalesha Bullard. Kalesha Bullard is a postdoc researcher at Facebook AI Research. Before joining FAIR, she completed her PhD at Georgia Tech in computer science. And her research out there lied at the intersection of human-robot interaction and machine learning in interactive robot learning. During a postdoc, Kalesha has expanded her research to explore the space of multi-agent reinforcement learning. And she's currently investigating how to enable embodied multi-agent populations to learn general communication protocols. She has participated in a number of service roles throughout her research career. And she's currently a member of the organizing committee for the NeurIPS 2020 workshop on zero-shot emergent communication. And she's a PC for the NeurIPS 2020 Cooperative AI workshop. And her recent prior appointments also include an area chair for the 2019 NeurIPS Women in Machine Learning, and the program committee member for the 2019 International Conference on Autonomous Agents and Multi-Agent Systems, and the program committee co-chair for the 2017 AAAI Fall Symposium on AI for Human-Robot Interaction. So without further delay, let's get started. So if anyone has questions, feel free to leave it on the chat or raise your hand, and I will regularly monitor that and I'll interrupt Kalesha at the end of a slide so that you can ask your clarification question. So Kalesha, over to you.
Thank you, Kalpesh, for the introduction. I just want to echo what Kalpesh just said. I would love for it to be more interactive, and I'm going to try to pause at certain points, although sometimes when I get in the flow, I forget to do that. But please feel free to interrupt me to ask any questions, clarifying questions, or if you want to dive a bit deeper, and I'm happy to chat more about that. So I am a postdoc. I'm Kalesha Bullard, and I'm a postdoc at Facebook AI Research. I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I've been working on. So the key theme of my research has been on learning through interaction within multi-agent systems. And today I'm going to present research in that space. I'm going to discuss also in depth an ongoing project that I'm leading on and that I'm really excited about on learning to interact through interaction for embodied agents. So a recent multi-agent systems symposium in the UK defined a multi-agent system as one that consists of multiple decision-making agents which interact in a shared environment to achieve common or conflicting goals. And so I've highlighted 3 of those words in particular that are relevant to the talk today. So interaction is an important component in an actual multi-agent system. And this is going to be a key theme of the work that I will be discussing in this talk. The idea that the agents exist in some shared environment is important for the idea that they need to be achieving either common or conflicting goals, right? Because they are coexisting in an environment. And so the work that I'll talk about today, we're looking at agents that are in particular considering common goals, so cooperative AI settings. Now, the images above are simply intended to show a diverse set of multi-agent systems beginning to be used both in the real world and in people's homes. And notably, they show the heterogeneous nature of multi-agent systems. Inherently, they include both multiple artificial agents and humans, whether explicitly shown or implicitly, we know that humans coexist in these shared environments. And presumably all of these agents are pursuing shared goals. So my research broadly takes inspiration from these types of problem settings. So my overarching research interests are really looking at this bidirectional relationship between reasoning and learning for artificial agents and multi-agent systems or contexts. So the top arrow speaks to this idea that individual agents within a population need to be able to reason and learn about interactions within that multi-agent system. And then the bottom arrow speaks to the idea that the multi-agent system itself is going to be influencing the models of individual agents that exist within that system. And so both directions interest me. These represent 2 different problems that you would imagine are important in cooperative multi-agent settings, that of agents extracting or exchanging information, from one another or exchanging information, and that of agents coordinating. And we'll actually talk about 2 different problem settings in my talk today, one of each of these. And so my kind of an underlying hypothesis and theme of my work is that agents can benefit from the ability to interact effectively with other agents in that multi-agent system. So speaking of multi-agent systems where learning is taking place and interaction is happening, this brings us to the second piece of the title, which is learning through interaction within a multi-agent system. So I'd like you to look at the person who looks more contemplative in this image, presumably the young man who's either maybe a student of this teacher or maybe the son of a father. And I want you to think about, take a minute to think about what you think may be going through his mind regarding his interlocutor, so regarding the teacher. So for me, I have a hypothesis about a few things that come to mind. The first is that if he's contemplating, that he's probably trying to interpret the interlocutor's communication so that he can process information being given to him. The other two have to do with the fact that if you want to learn through interaction, so this is a multi-agent system in that you have two decision-making agents. And if he wants to learn through the interaction, he's a student, if he wants to learn from the teacher, then there are at least two things that he needs to consider with respect to interacting with that teacher. The first is what he would want to communicate and when. When can be encompassed by the what, because you can consider what being actions and you can take the action of not communicating. So we can encompass when through what. So what it is that he wants to communicate, if anything, towards some higher level aim, he needs to be considering that as he's contemplating and presumably interrupt if he needs to. And then the other being how to communicate such that the interlocutor can appropriately interpret his communication and respond, right? So this talk will focus on the latter 2 points for enabling agents within multi-agent systems to exploit interaction towards achieving common goals. So let's start to more precisely characterize the decision problems that will be explored in this work and that I'll be presenting. This timeline represents a longer term interaction horizon. So the first problem that we'll think about is this problem of what to communicate. So some kind of higher level intent, communicative intent. G is an element of G. And here the capital G represents some set of communicative intents. So you could imagine if it were gestures, it could be things like yes, no, I don't know, turn left, turn right. If there were questions, it could be things like, ask a question about, what this object is called, or ask for a demonstration of this concept, etc. So it's a high level intent and there's a set of intents. And so at each of these course decision points, you have an artificial agent that needs to be able to reason about whether or not to communicate. So one of these intents could be to not communicate. So whether or not to communicate and what intent is optimal to communicate. And then the second decision problem is really that of generating communication conditioned upon the intent. So there's this implicit assumption that the how, so the top is really about what to communicate and the bottom is about how to communicate conditioned upon the what. There's an implicit assumption that how takes multiple steps. So for example, if you said, I want to, the intent was to communicate yes to a question, then the how could be either nodding your head, which would be a sequence of body postures that would happen at much higher frequency, or it could be something like a sentence like, yeah, that sounds good, which will be a sequence of symbols, right? And so, but regardless, in this bottom problem, it's really about generating a trajectory that is going to instantiate the particular goal that was selected on the high level, right? So it's about executing the what. All right, so these are the two decision problems that we'll be primarily focused on in this talk. So an outline of the talk, first I will start with motivating context, prior work in human-robot interaction. So as Kalesha said, my PhD work was actually in human-robot interaction, which you could think about as one instance of a multi-agent system. And I'll spend about a third of the talk talking about this, and then I'll dive much deeper into my ongoing work, which is moving towards learning communication in embodied multi-agent populations. So we go to a more abstract environment, simulated, where multiple artificial agents are learning how to communicate with one another. And we will talk about training through cooperative games and then evaluating in a zero-shot coordination setting, which is a way to evaluate generalization of the coordination policies. So first, let's talk about the prior work. So my prior work in human agent interaction fell along two different threads. The first, encompassed by the top arrow, is really about learning from demonstration. So a human agent selects data in order to demonstrate to a robotic agent or some kind of artificial agent. And so the agent this is a supervised learning problem where the agent learns through observation, but presumably this data was selected offline and there's not presumably an online interaction happening. And then the latter half of my PhD work really focused on this bottom thread, which is learning through interaction, where now you have this online interaction happening between the artificial agent and the human, and the artificial agent is taking a more active role in this learning process and querying the human for training data. So this really falls in the paradigm of active learning. So given that this talk is really about learning through interaction, then what I'm going to highlight is work from this bottom arrow. So the two works that I'll discuss from this kind of thread of research really fall in this broader umbrella of active learning in realistic human settings. And these are my collaborators on this work, Sonia Chinova being my PhD advisor. The learning task is for an agent to learn and continue to adapt models, grounded models for each for a set of given object concepts that exist in some non-stationary environment, where the agent exists in a non-stationary environment. So here's an example of the non-stationarity that the agent might see in its physical environment. And this is really about active learning, continual learning problem settings. So let's say an agent wants to cook pasta or wants to make lunch, right? And so lunch maybe encompasses some kind of main dish like pasta as well as fruit like bananas. Then here the agent needs to be grounding these concepts, but over time, how the concepts are instantiated may actually change. So when you take the pasta out of the cupboard, it's in a box, but then when you go to cook it, it's in a pot, and then later it's in a bowl when you want to serve it, for example, right? And this can change over some shorter horizon period, like over the course of a task, but it could also change over the course of, a longer extended period as food is being prepared in the home. So this really represents this idea of concept drift, and the agent needs to be able to continually adapt its concept models in order to encompass different instantiations of the concepts. And so where active learning plays a role here is active learning will implement the querying strategy that controls the input the agent uses to train the concept model. So the agent takes an active role in collecting training data from the human oracle. And a query budget is given to represent this idea that the agent doesn't have infinite access to the human. Okay, so the computational framework here was a belief state decision theoretic active learning framework, which we contributed for this active learning, continual learning problem setting. You have a learner, you have an oracle, and you have some dynamically changing environment. So the set of states are a set of learning belief states, and it's taking in information from the non-stationary environment, as well as from the oracle giving feedback, presumably in the prior time step or prior time steps. The set of actions are communication actions, so the agent can ask different types of queries towards training its models, as well as choose not to query. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about both of these. The transition model is actually only an agent-based model. So the agent is only reasoning about its expectations of the oracle's response. So it assumes a static environment and is trying to reason about what query will be most advantageous given what it expects the oracle to respond with. And then there's the utility function in reinforcement learning. This is called the reward function, and other more general decision problem domains that may be called an objective function. I'll typically refer to it as objective function in this work. So the decision problem is, fundamentally it is a decision problem in that this interaction is having, it is a sequential decision problem in that the interaction is happening over time, but active learning as a paradigm or as a problem typically takes a myopic planning approach. So the agent, it's very expensive to forward simulate at decision time to simulate what are the different next states that a particular action will is expected to lead to. and do decision time planning. It's actually quite expensive for active learning. So typically the approach that is taken is to do myopic planning, where the agent only reasons about a one step look ahead. So this is what we also do in this work. And the goal here is to maximize expected utility of taking action given the current state. And this is an online planning kind of regime. So in this next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the state and action space, as well as I'll give you a high level of the types of features that the utility function will try to model. Okay. Oh, let me pause here. Are there questions so far?
Yeah, I don't see any hand raised or anything on the chat. So I think we can move ahead. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the computational framework is, okay. So the belief state is at the top left, you see the learning belief state. It's a learner's, okay, so I'm sorry. X is the set of object instances in the agent's environment. And capital Y is the set of concepts or labels that the agent needs to be trying to ground. So the learner's belief state is the learner's estimate of the conditional probability distribution of each of the concepts Y, given each of the unlabeled object instances X in its scene. And each PXY represents the probability that a particular object instance belongs to a particular class, so that it's an instantiation of a particular concept. So on the row-wise picture, what you have is, for each of these X's, what you have is an instance conditional distribution. What that's saying is for each of the X's, which are object instances, you really want to learn some unimodal distribution over the true label for that particular object instance. And on the column-wise picture, which is the class conditional distributions, what it's saying is for each of the concepts the agent has to ground, you want to learn a multimodal distribution where the peaks represent positive examples of that concept. So you can imagine in the very beginning of learning, it's a uniform distribution. This is effectively an estimate of the joint probability distribution between concepts and instances. It starts off as a uniform distribution, and you want over time this distribution to evolve into representing the true underlying joint probability distribution. And the types of actions it can make are, it can ask for demonstrations of concepts, like, can you give me a demonstration of pasta? It can ask for label queries for objects, like, what is this called? And the human can say, oh, that's also a fruit. It can ask about feature subsets that are coming from its sensory feedback, and it can choose to not make a query. And so this is the action selection function that we saw in the previous slide. So learners trying to select an action that maximizes expected utility in the current state. And I'm not going to dig into the details of the learner's objective function, because for the purposes of this talk, it's really not that important. But suffice it to say that here, the decision criteria are the phi's, so each individual mathematical functions, and they're trying to measure expected learning progress. So given these instance conditional distributions on the row picture and the class conditional distributions on the column picture, it's trying to take statistical measures over these distributions in order to compute some expected learning progress. And the structure of the objective function is a linear combination of these decision criteria, which means the agent is trading off these different individual objectives in order to assess expected progress in learning. So decision criteria are designed to be task agnostic, so they should be sufficiently general for a broad range of active learning tasks. Okay, so that's all I really want to say about those. So as a concrete instantiation, here are examples of non-stationarity that the agent might encounter. And so these two plots show the vertical gray lines show when environmental change happens. The dots show when the agent makes a query in the environment. The y-axis shows the accuracy on the test set after that query is made. And then the green line shows when all of your baseline active learning strategies finish depleting their query budget. So here the query budget was 60 queries. On the left side, the environmental change happens every 20 turns. So the baseline strategies only see about 3 different environmental states. Whereas on the right side, the change happens every turn. And the orange line represents when the experimental strategy that we propose finishes depleting its budget. So basically what you see here is that the strategy is able to adapt to the non-stationarity within the environment. So the pattern of the dots is similar, except compressed in the case where there's more rapid change. And so this particular strategy is able to acquire a relatively representative training sample independent of how quickly the environment changes. And so it makes effective use of its query budget to do that. So with respect to the story that we've been talking about, these dots represent the what. It's reasoning about what, when there's no dots, that means it's choosing not to query. So it's reasoning about the when inherently, but it's also reasoning about the what. Every single time you see a dot, it's selecting a particular communication action that it believes is optimal for achieving some longer term goals. And so this gets at, how this work really starts to reason about the question of what to communicate towards some higher level aim in the interaction. Okay, so we're going to revisit this diagram throughout this talk to characterize the decision problems. And in this first decision problem, what we see is the type of reasoning is deliberative in nature. So it's, it's planning at decision time and deliberating. Using its objective function. The environment is non-stationary because it's physically changing. It is modeling the oracle over time. It's updating its model. And the reasoning time horizon is myopic. It only reasons one time step out. And the actions are just choosing between a set of communicative intent, so they're discrete in nature. Okay, so then the second iteration of this work, so I'm not gonna say too much about this because I do wanna move on to the multi-agent work. But in the second iteration of this work, we added a more diverse set of decision criteria. So basically what we wanted was the agent to be able to trade off its own individual learning objectives with constraints of the teacher. So to consider the other agent in this environment. This is a multi-agent system. So it wants to achieve common goals. So it should not only consider its own objectives, but the teacher's constraints. And in particular, it's constraints like, what percentage of the teacher's time allocation have I used? Maybe the teacher's only around for 30 minutes, maybe the teacher's around all day. You would change your strategy given how much time you thought you had. So it should be considering how much time allocation has it used? How much of its budget consumption, how much of its budget has it consumed? So the query budget roughly represents how much cognitive availability the teacher has to answer questions. If it gets a small query budget, that means the teacher's quite busy, so it can't ask that many questions and it needs to use that small query budget wisely. If it gets a very large query budget, it means the teacher is very available, and so maybe it can ask a lot of questions, right? But it should be able to adapt to the teacher's constraints, is the idea. And the way that we learn this is through imitation learning. So you don't really need to know the details of that, but this gray box shows the high level picture. You have an expert who was me in our experiments, who has a policy of how to ask, an expert questioner who has a policy of how to ask questions. The expert gives a set of demonstrations D, so tau means a set of each tau is a trajectory, which is a set of queries asked given different learning states. And then the learner infers a policy pi L based upon the expert's demonstrations. And the goal here is to recover the expert's reward function. So we use inverse reinforcement learning. And concretely, at the bottom, if you look at the objective function, we're trying to learn the weights, how the expert trades these off. Okay, great. So yeah, so that's all I really want to say about that, I think. Here, so you don't need to know about all of these lines. The key line I want you to pay attention to is the red line. The red line is the experimental strategy. And we set the time frame here. On the left side, the agent is given a low query budget. On the right side is given order of magnitude more query budget. And the red line is the only one able to really proficiently adapt its query strategy in a major way. So when it gets an order of magnitude more query budget, it actually asks an order of magnitude more questions. To be fair, one limitation is the questions did start to get redundant near the end, so there were still open questions here. But the point here is that the agent was able to recognize in the left side, the teacher doesn't have a lot of cognitive load. I shouldn't ask that many questions. On the right side, the teacher has a lot of availability. I can ask a lot of questions. So again, we're getting to this point of what. The agent is reasoning about what communication actions to take. In this case, given the context of the other agent in that environment, which is the human. Okay. So from that first work to the second work, the problem setting was exactly the same. And in fact, the experiments were on the same tasks. But what we changed was now instead of a completely hand-designed objective function, manually designed objective function, we had a partially learned objective function. We use imitation learning combined with planning. Okay, so last thing I want to show about this work is I want to show this video in the background while I tell you one key thing that I learned at the end of my PhD, which was I was convinced before doing this, having to hard code this demo. This is a demonstration. It's a hard coded demo. It's not an autonomous interaction. I took the interaction from my console and hard coded it on the robot. And I was convinced before that point that the only thing that really mattered is an agent who's trying to achieve goals through interaction just needs to reason about the high level intents it has. And then some other module can reason about how it should instantiate those intents or execute those intents. And in this work, this demonstration showed me that you can't completely decouple the what from the how. So there are three things in particular that I would not have been able to disambiguate even if the agent had the correct communicative intent, unless the communicative behavior was transparent. The first thing is in version 0 of this demonstration, the agent was just looking down the table and it would say the query. If this were an autonomous interaction, I would not have any idea who it was talking to unless it looked at me, because there will be multiple people in the lab. And so how would I know which person it was directing the question to? The second thing is it would ask about a particular object, like what is this called? Which means it doesn't know the name of the object, so it can't call it by name. That's why it's asking me for the label. But if it doesn't look at the object or point to the object, I have no idea which object it's referencing. So that communicative behavior was important to disambiguate its intent. And the third thing is thinking behavior. I implemented this behavior where it looks around the table when it's thinking. And this was important because if it's just looking down, I don't know if the hardware, so you see it looking around right now. I don't know if the hardware malfunctioned. I don't know if the robot turned off. I don't know if the interaction is over, if it's just looking down. But if it's looking around the table, then what that communicates to me is you're thinking about stuff on the table. So I should either wait for you to finish or leave and then come back, right? And so again, the how becomes really important for disambiguating the what. And that's what we learned here. All right, great. So returning to our diagram, so we focused on the what to communicate up to this point. The agent is selecting communicative intents and they can choose not to communicate. And now we're going to go to the how, where the agent is thinking about how to generate trajectories conditioned upon the what. And with respect to our diagram, a key thing to point out here is I had to hand code those behaviors, in order to have an agent communicate the how to me. That's not scalable. You don't want the system designer to have to hand code behaviors. And it's also the case that when you go to the how, you're going to have these high dimensional continuous actions, and you can't necessarily plan or even think about ahead of time what the decision criteria should be. So this really motivates going from planning-based reasoning to reinforcement learning-based reasoning. And now we're going to go to a reactive paradigm where the agent is no longer planning at decision time. It learns a policy offline, and it should be able to quickly, make low latency decisions and react. And then now this becomes a sequential decision problem, because also myopic decision making is not ideal. What you really want is for the agent to reason about the entire episode and make good decisions for long-term consequences. All right. And now we can also learn the policy with a neural network as opposed to hand designing it. That was also important. So, okay, so let's motivate why. So you might think to yourself, okay, I agree with you that how matters, but why, why do we need to learn it strictly through RL? Why can't we use something like imitation learning? So imagine you have all these embodied agents that exist and operate in a shared environment. This is famous Professor Maya Matarik from USC with her social robots, right? So how could these agents learn to communicate to aid in coordination? And you might think, what about supervised learning from data sets? Well, the problem is each of these agents have a different embodiment, which means that you would need a different data set for each of them to look at how they communicate. And you would need a huge data set for each of them, particularly if you want to cover a lot of different communication actions. So this is a really, big effort. So what about imitation learning from human demonstrations? Well, human time is costly. And on top of that, imitation learning from non-humanoid, like non-anthropomorphic agents it is always a little bit tricky. And so you have to figure out how to be able to do that in a way that's efficient and effective. But let's say you could do those things. Let's say you could get the data. What if an unforeseen event happens, like a pandemic, and it completely changes the way people communicate, right? And so now the agents need to adapt or altogether change their protocol or the way they coordinate. Then, you know, what's nice about multi-agent reinforcement learning is it provides an opportunity to allow agents to learn through a protocol through agent-agent interactions. So without the need for huge existing data sets, agents can, you know, flexibly adapt or even relearn a protocol in accordance with the setting they exist in. Okay, great. So from human learning, human agent to multi-agent. So we're going from learning from human agent interaction and doing decision time planning to reason about what, to learning to interact with other agents and doing multi-agent RL to reason about how. Okay, so now we'll talk a bit about the embodied problem setting, which is a bit different from the problem setting that many of the multi-agent communication literature is focused on, training with cooperative games, and then evaluation in a zero-shot coordination setting. And so this work is joint work with some awesome collaborators at FAIR, and it was recently submitted, so it's under review, and it's on exploring zero-shot emergent communication in embodied multi-agent populations. So the question here is, so you see these agents that are motivated by real agents like a human and a robot, but of course much more simplistic, so we've moved to this more abstract space. How do you emerge generalizable communication skills for these embodied agents? Through motion or physical action. And it's motivated by the idea that embodied agents such as humans and robots inherently communicate through movement, whether intentional or not. And if we want to move towards human level intelligence, which is a form of embodied intelligence, we need artificial embodied agents to be able to communicate through this more realistic channel. So this is a sample of prior work from the multi-agent communication literature, and it's not intended to be exhaustive or for you to absorb most of this. It's just to briefly illustrate where the recent prior literature is focused. And in particular, the key limitation for embodied agents is that it's focused on symbolic or discrete communication channels. So like sequences of symbols like words, for example. It also assumes a cheap talk setting, which means generating a message is not costly. So let's give us some background first. What does it mean to learn a communication protocol? So you have a population of agents, here are blue, green, and orange. You have a set of concepts that are given a priori. And the underlying idea is that each agent in the population must learn to generate messages for every concept in the library that's been given a priori. So the learning problem is for every agent to learn a policy that maps the set of concepts to the message space. I feel like I didn't stop after the first part of the work. Were there any questions? Sorry, forgot.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat box if you have a question.
Yeah, please feel free. I'll keep going otherwise, but I'm very happy to answer questions, so please feel free to stop me. Yeah. Okay, so in order to learn these policies, we use reinforcement learning. So of course, this looks similar to the diagram I showed in the active learning because it's, again, a decision theoretic reasoning framework. The key difference between decision theory for active learning and decision theory for reinforcement learning is this box, the reward function. In the active learning work, I had to hand design the reward function, and we call it a utility function. And in reinforcement learning, the agent will learn return through interactions with its environment, and we'll actually model the reward function through a neural network. So it's, so this is the difference. So now we want to go to multi-agent reinforcement learning. So now the environment is no longer assumed to be stationary, it's non-stationary because you have another agent who is learning in parallel. So the agents are co-learning or co-adapting to one another. So from the perspective of any given agent, the world seems non-stationary. And multi-agent training regimes, there are two key regimes, centralized and decentralized. The key difference is in centralized training, the agents can talk to each other during training. So you can back propagate signal, whereas in decentralized, they cannot. And then typically both are paired with decentralized execution at inference time or decision time, where agents can only use their own sensory input and acquired knowledge to execute the task. So we play a referential game to train this protocol, which is very commonly employed in multi-agent communication. This is a cooperative setting where you have a sender that gets a concept from the concept library. It generates a message that the receiver sees or listens to. The receiver will make a prediction about what's being communicated, and then the loss is back propagated. So it's called referential because the receiver is trying to infer what concept the sender is referring to. Right, so a very simple game, but quite effective. So our problem setting in particular, we talk about embodied cooperative games, right? So we have this agent which has joints and limbs, in this case 4 joints. So the state space is basically the body posture of the agent. There's 6 degrees of freedom for every joint, X, Y, Z position, and roll, pitch, yaw, rotation. Action spaces that we allow agents to rotate their joints. They can't move in X, Y, Z dimensions, otherwise the joints could detach from each other and you want the agent to stay as one body, but they can rotate joints. Concepts in our domain are communicative intent. So we motivated the work talking about agents who select communicative intent in the human agent problem setting. So now the agents are given these communicative intents as their concepts. The messages that they can generate are motion trajectories through this high dimensional continuous channel. And then the time horizons are fixed. So sender and receiver agents, that's typically the terminology that people use in the literature. And they're encapsulated by policy networks and discriminator networks, respectively. But you also may hear me call them actors because the senders are acting out a message since it's nonverbal, and observers because the observers are observing joint angles. I'll try to stick to one set of terminology, but just in case these are synonymous. Okay, so the key question here is, under what realistic minimal common knowledge constraints can we obtain zero-shot coordination for these physical communication protocols? And you know, if you think about it, we talked about human agent, we motivated with human agent. Now we're in the multi-agent, purely multiple artificial agents, but we do want artificial agents that are compatible with human agents later. I mean, particularly for downstream applications. So at the very first, you know, initially what we would think is the agents need to be self-compatible. They need to be able to at least talk to each other. And zero-shot coordination is a setting where effectively you pair agents with strangers at test time, and you want to see if they can coordinate. An important challenge in this, for this problem domain, is that when you pair a high dimensional continuous channel like motion with self-play, you get a highly non-convex optimization landscape. What that means is you have a lot of local optima, so a lot of different ways on converging on a protocol. And if you want a protocol that can generalize at test time to strangers, then really what you want to do is constrain that space such that agents will converge on protocols with similar properties, and then they'll be expected to be able to coordinate later, even with agents they've never seen. So we have to induce bias in order to do that. So we induce bias from real world settings because that's where embodied agents exist. So we take cost of physical energy exertion, which you would expect for generating physical communication. This means a non-cheap talk setting. We instantiate this through energy regularization. And then we also take inspiration from realistic settings in that communicative intents don't typically occur with the same frequency. Some will occur at higher frequency than others. So we induce this non-uniform distribution. So when you pair these two together, what do you get? What you get is an agent who is incentivized to minimize energy, and it's going to try to minimize energy most for the intents that occur with the highest frequency, right? So what I want to do is drive down the most frequent intent to the lowest energy because that's how I will minimize my loss. And then the second most frequent intent will have the second, lowest energy exertion, and so on and so forth. So what you get is this one-to-one mapping between the intent rank or the intent frequency and the amount of energy exertion paired with that intent. And that's
Kalesha,
exactly what
I had a quick clarification question.
Yes.
Yeah, on the previous slide. So could you give an example of what these communicative intents are that the robots need to communicate with each other? The concepts or the intents, like just some examples in this specific setting?
Yes. In this specific setting, the intents are arbitrary. They're just numbers, 1 through 100. But I mean, what you would imagine is if it were application domain, it could be like no, yes. And so no would map to this, and yes would map to that. And so we'll get a set of these no, yes, turn right, turn left, et cetera. We'll get a set of these abstract intents. And then for each of those, it needs to learn some distribution over trajectories that would allow it to communicate that intent.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome. Good question. It's easy to forget that I need to say these kinds of things. So the way that we do this is we try to induce this energy-based latent structure. So we want to induce we want to induce a relationship where there's high mutual information between a set of intents and this predefined latent variable and trajectories, which is, in this case, the only latent feature is energy. So in learning any protocol, what you would expect is high mutual information between the intents and the messages, which is G and tau. Tau is the trajectory, which is the message. So the very left part of this means, this is what you want for any protocol. So for this particular protocol, what we're trying to do is reduce the dimensionality of the messages. So we want to see mutual information between the intent and the latent feature on the trajectories, but we also want to still preserve the informativeness. So we want high mutual information between intents and energy values on the trajectories. So what this means is high mutual information is really going to map to low conditional entropy. So a low entropy over your set of intents, given the latent feature on your trajectories. In the limit, what you'd expect is given some energy over your trajectory, or some energy computation on your trajectory, you would be, the agent should be able to predict the true intent with probability 1, and other intent should have probability 0. So you want to converge on a unimodal distribution over the true intent, given just the energy value. What this allows the agent, a new receiver agent, to do is decouple the actual way that independent actors communicate with the intent being communicated. So two actors can have very different trajectories, but if they assign similar energy to those trajectories, a new receiver can still decode the message. Okay, so we sample a batch. So for protocol training, this is the game. Sample a batch of intents from the set. The policy pi will take in the intent and joint state at every single time step and produce an action. The trajectory will be a rollout of joint states and velocity actions. The discriminator will get the trajectory and make a prediction about the intent being communicated. The loss is back propagated. You don't really need to know the details of this return, but what you do need to know is that there's two components: communication success and energy penalty. And the agent is trading those off, the actor agents or the senders. So basically you have a bunch of sender receiver pairs that are training in parallel, but they're independently training. So doing self-play for the protocol training. And then the last part of the method is train this external observer, which is going to, so we separate the initially trained actors into two sets, a training and a test set. We initialize a new receiver, and then that receiver will train with only the training actors, and then it will test on the test actors to see if it can coordinate with these strangers. If it does, that's zero-shot coordination, because there's no reason to believe that the test agents were ever influenced by the training agents, since they trained independently. So qualitative analysis, we did 3 different tasks, but I'm going to show 2 here. So there's a proof of concept task with 2 intents. And so the top middle shows the energy cost over time. This is a little bit counterintuitive in that the time is actually on the y-axis. So the energy cost, the beginning of training, this is over the course of training. The beginning of training is at the top, and then the energy cost traverses down to the bottom, which is the end of training. And so these represents two different intents, intent 1 and intent 2. And the Gaussians on the right side show an estimate of the energy distribution for intents 1 and 2 at the very end of training, so at 10,000 at the bottom. And what we see here is that we actually achieve this high mutual information. If you were to take the entropy over this distribution of intents, given just the energy values, it would be almost 0, which means that if I'm a new receiver and I just see the energy values, I can, with almost perfect accuracy predict which intent is being communicated. Okay? And that's what we wanted to see. So this is visualization of the learned policy. And with respect to zero-shot coordination, we actually looked at 2 things. At test time, we gave the new receiver trajectories from the actors, which is tau, and we also gave the new receiver the energy values of those trajectories, which is phi of tau. The max class here is about 67%, 2/3. What we see is zero-shot coordination is really high when we give it the energy values, but it's able to do barely better than the max class when we don't give the energy values, which means that there's a separate problem. The first The first challenge is we need to induce the latent structure in the actors learning the policies. The second one is that the receivers need to be able to discover that structure at test time, otherwise they can't exploit it. So this represents an open challenge. Discovery of the latent structure. So, so now we go to a more complex task, 5 intents, in order to understand how performance degrades as you make the communication task harder. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways that 3 different agents solve this problem. So this first agent was able to come up with the optimal ordering. What we want to see is at the very bottom, the energy exertions match the order of the intent ranks. So we want to see the energy exertions in order of the actual intent ranks. L here is the total loss value. So this agent converged on an optimal solution. It found the desired energy intent mapping by the end. This agent converged on a solution that was not as good. It didn't find the desired energy intent mapping because it actually switches 5 and 4. So what you see is, you know, intent 5 comes before intent 4 in the end. But what you also see is that the loss values are actually quite similar to each other. So part of the challenge is, if you look at the distribution of intent 5 and intent 4 at the bottom of on the intent distribution plot, the intents have a very similar likelihood. So an optimization algorithm is not going to incur that much loss for switching the energy exertions of these 2. But if it were, but it could be the case that if it tries to put them in the correct order, it will incur loss with respect to prediction accuracy. And so it may not be advantageous to get the energies in the correct order if it's going to incur a lot of cost with respect to the receiver being able to predict what's being communicated. So this is a multi-objective optimization problem. So this is what makes it tricky. And then the last one, this agent did the worst job. It was not able to get any of the intents in the desired order. And again, but the loss for this is really not that different. At least from my perspective, it doesn't seem to be. So a key takeaway is that the optimization problem to find the strict ordering on these continuous energy values becomes harder and increases because we're implicitly trying to induce this through the likelihood. If the likelihoods are very similar for 2 intents, then it makes it, the optimization algorithm is not as incentivized to get that right at the cost of prediction. So, but it's that having a consistent pattern across how different agents solve the problem is important for zero-shot coordination, because a new receiver has to be able to extract the consistent pattern from the training agents and then use that to make predictions about the test agents. So this is actually a really important problem for getting zero-shot coordination. And we do see the zero-shot coordination performance goes down as the task gets harder. However, it's still like over 30% higher than the max class when you give it the latent feature. So it's still significantly better than the max class. But again, we see this trend where it's not able to discover the latent structure. So key contributions of this work, we emerged these high dimensional continuous protocols, and we explored inducing a minimal set of realistic common knowledge constraints for enabling zero-shot coordination. However, some of the key open challenges, I mean, we still need to figure out a way to guide the policy search towards more robustly finding global optima, because oftentimes agents are not converging on the optimal protocol. And then there's also this question of automatically discovering the latent structure. You really don't want to have to tell the agents about the latent features. You want them to discover it for themselves. So another thread of open challenge, which is orthogonal, but you know, we think back to, you know, our video with the human and the robot, we saw this very natural looking, you know, interaction. And so we really do want to be able to emerge protocols that are more meaningful, particularly if you want them to be compatible with humans later down the line, because humans already have a protocol. They have a very strong prior in terms of how agents should communicate. And so you really want to be able to bias the protocol with respect to that if you want them to be human compatible. So this is, you know, opportunities for thinking about how you combine self-play with some kind of supervisory signal or other natural priors. Okay, great. So this is what we were in this reactive, so we went from deliberation to reaction, from planning to multi-agent reinforcement learning, from manually designing the objective function to learning it through a neural network. And we have this high dimensional continuous action space, and we are no longer modeling the other agents in this particular work. It also is the case that the environment is still non-stationary, but not because the physical environment is changing, but because you have other agents that are learning in parallel. So a summary of the contributions of this work: we looked at active learning and human agent, implicitly active learning, and multi-agent reinforcement learning. And really, I did want to draw there's some different parallels that one can draw between active learning and reinforcement learning, and that could be an offline conversation, but I do want to say that a key thing is that they're complementary, and that active learning really seeks to give instructive feedback, so the agent is getting like labels or demonstrations or whatever, corrections, and reinforcement learning seeks to give evaluative feedback. The agent is being told how good its actions or sequence of actions were. So we contributed this decision theoretic framework for enabling an agent to reason about its learning belief state, and a diverse set of communication actions, which is really about the what and the when. And it was in a continual learning environment. And we enabled it to optimize for both its own learning objectives and the constraints of the teacher. And then the reinforcement learning work, we investigated the emergence of embodied protocols, which is more about the how, through inducing bias with a minimal set of common knowledge constraints. And the goal was to enable zero-shot coordination, or this generalization of the communication protocol. And we also contributed insights on finding globally optimal protocols in this high dimensional continuous channel, or given a high dimensional continuous channel. With respect to some future decision problems.
Kalesha,
sorry.
Yeah, we have a question.
Oh yeah.
So Katie, do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just a quick question on the agents that were sort of using sort of the joints in order to convey communication, which map to an intent. I was wondering if you could just talk about where you think sort of this space between having like a real valued communication versus discrete, like words, language is potentially discrete. And so sort of like from an optimization standpoint, was it easier to be in the real valued space? And if so, how do you map that onto real language if you actually want to communicate with natural language with these robots? And so if you could just touch on that a little bit, of like how you would map that to trying to get to more realistic communication.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's this idea of like multimodal communication with language, the symbols and gestures, for example. So from an optimization perspective, I think that one thing that's nice about the continuous channel is that you can easily do back propagation. You don't have to come up with some kind of ways around, with symbolic communication, it's not as straightforward. And the structure is, the structure is quite different in terms of if you want to look at latent structure in the action space for symbolic versus continuous. So I think in that way, continuous has this nice smoothness property. What else was I going to say? But because of the fact that you have these high dimensional continuous channels, you have a lot of expressivity. And so there are a lot of ways for agents to learn policies, which means a lot of local minima. So it's really quite challenging to figure out, to get agents to converge on similar local minima such that you can see generalization. So this is one difference, I think, between symbolic. There's a lot of opportunity for expression, but it's still not quite as expressive as these high dimensional continuous channels. With respect to synchronizing, the first thing that comes to my mind is really through some kind of supervisory signal to coordinate the language with so actually when I very first started my postdoc, I started looking at work on synchronizing language and gestures. I was like, oh, I want to dive into communication. And then I started realizing that maybe I was more interested in the multi-agent reasoning problem, but certainly I don't know how you would do that completely emergently, because what you do need, there's all these questions about exactly when the gesture starts and stops in order to convey, particularly if you have like an iconic gesture, like this shrug, it has to happen at exactly the same time as you say, I don't know. You can't say, I don't know, and then be like 2 seconds later, do a shrug, So there are this very clear temporal component that's quite important. The frequency matters. you know, if you're trying to do an exclamation with language, then you might need to do really high frequency or really exaggerated motion. So there's all these features that really kind of come into play when you talk about synchronizing language and gesture. So I think that supervision is really very important there. But I'm not sure how you do it completely emergently. Yeah.
Gotcha. Super interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Basically, just quickly, I want to show this chart. Interesting feature directions. I'm just going to show a couple things on this chart. One is that I would be very, so this is kind of what we saw before. I want to stay in this multi-agent RL regime and learning policies, but I would be very interested in looking at where modeling an agent actually plays a role. I think that's, you know, I'd like to return to that, because I think in communication, at least for me, and for many people, you not only think about what you want to communicate, you think about who you're talking to, and you certainly adapt your communication to the agent that you're talking to and your model of that agent. And then the other thing that seems like an obvious thing is hierarchical reasoning. So the what and the how, like how does the agent reason about both what it should be communicating and how, and learning this hierarchical reasoning kind of problem. Okay, so that's where I want to finish that off. So I'm not going to go through these other questions that I put down. I'm just going to go ahead and say thank you to my collaborators again that I've talked about in this work. And I'm happy to take questions. And at the bottom is my contact information, but I'm also happy to take more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kalesha. This was an awesome talk. So let's all unmute ourselves and thank the speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions. So yeah, feel free to enter them in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, so that we have order. Okay, so maybe I can get started. So I had a couple of questions. I'll ask you one of them now. So yeah, you mentioned concepts, and like thinking of the example that you gave me, I thought like concepts are they tend to be more hierarchical rather than a table. So for instance, you often smile when you want to communicate a number of when you want to communicate a number of things, and you smile along with do something else to like get to a specific communicative intent. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on this, and like what kind of motions would you expect agents to emerge in such concept data distributions?
I think you're muted, Kalesha.
Yeah. I think you're still muted. It still shows mute. Maybe I can try to, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, now it's all good. Yeah.
Okay, good. I think I didn't completely understand the question. So you said something about smiling. And
yeah. So what I thought is that that in a real world scenario, many of the intents are likely to have some relation with each other. So for instance, you often smile to communicate a number of different things along with some other action to like complement it. So I was wondering like what are your thoughts on this, and what kind of motion would you expect an emergent agent to find here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, okay, so two things. One is that these emergent protocols are very far from being interpretable or meaningful. I do want to say that. I mean, this is a first step, but certainly if you want to get towards more meaningful behaviors and protocols that look like the protocols that humans have, then we need to integrate a supervisory signal, and that's still a little ways off. So with that being said, they're not realistic at this point in time. It's more just about the agents coordinating. But to your question though, it's okay if intents have, so for each intent, what you're learning is some distribution over trajectories. But it's okay, that's what the policy is effectively learning, but it's okay if intents have overlapping parts of those distributions. So if two different intents, like both yes and I'm excited, I don't know, both have this kind of smiling as part of their, as part of the gesture or the motion, that's okay. It's not the case that they need to be, mutually exclusive or distinctive in the trajectory space in any way, because the agent is not taking a message and oh, I guess, wait, the receiver agent is, so the receiver agent is taking a message and inferring intent from it. The actor agent just takes the intent and generates. But even still, there's something to differentiate those two, because still, even though there's a similar component, like both are smiling, maybe the yes has the nod and the I'm excited is, yay, I don't know. But I mean, so there's some part that will be similar and some part that will be different. So effectively, I think that's fine. If it is the case that two intents cannot be disambiguated at all because it's exactly the same motion, like distribution over trajectories, so the same exact motions are used to instantiate those, then I think that's a different question. And it also begs the question of, are they actually two separate semantically distinct intents,
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from Mari. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering if in your future work you think about modeling yourself also, because when we were talking about the latent variable of energy, I felt like normally as a human, I know what takes much energy for me, so I directly model how much energy something takes for the other one. And yeah, that should somehow be incorporated, like modeling myself to model the other one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's a good idea. I mean, it's something that I've kind of vaguely thought about. So I actually hadn't thought about this kind of modeling myself in order to effectively make inferences about the other person, because this starts to get more towards theory of mind. But theory of mind is I'm actually trying to model what I know about you versus I can't remember what the other one is called, but I've seen the like me hypothesis, where like, especially little kids, they think about what they would do and then assume, and so it's certainly a good prior. I mean, it's a good, and I've thought about this a little bit, because I also think that when I think about communicating with somebody, even not just trying to approximate their model, but even when I think about communicating with somebody as an adult, the way that I communicate depends on what seems authentic to me or what's consistent with the way I typically communicate. So given a different person who's communicating the same intent to the same receiver, they would communicate it differently than I would, because we have different ways of communicating, different weight styles, et cetera. So I think there's a place for this, but it's certainly in future work. I haven't figured out how to incorporate that by any means, but I like the idea of, like, when you think about like modeling the other agent, which is something I am really interested in, maybe even starting with a prior of what I think about myself and then refining it based upon what I learn about them.
Yeah, it's like you normally have a lot of data about yourself and not much about the other one.
Exactly. So it's like a good, like, pre-training the agent model based upon myself, and then I can refine it from there or something like this.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we have a question from Nadir.
Hi. So I kind of wanted to follow up maybe with Katie's question about discrete communication a little bit. It seems like one of the difficulties with trying to do emergent communication, if it does come to discrete modes of communication, is that it took time for language to develop to its current form. Presumably, we didn't have all these words, right? We're getting more and more specific words in order to convey more and more specific intent. And you can actually see that as language has developed over time. Like, is it possible to maybe start with a limited vocabulary and have agents sort of gain slowly a shared vocabulary for intents that might not exist in order to better like constrain the problem? Because, if you try to have a very large vocabulary, who says that they're going to, both have them emerge with the same distribution of like, hey, here's what the intents are for these various, with multiple agents, you have to have some way to enforce that. But if you have a very small vocabulary to start with, even just like yes, no, or I don't know what, like, and slowly sort of gain capability, does that make any sense in an embodied
No, that makes a lot of, I mean, in fact, actually, there was one thing that we tried was like an incremental learning curriculum, which was supposed to be just that, where I started with like 2 intents, and then the population will converge on that, and then I would go to the next one. This was trying to get the agents to all kind of converge on globally optimal solutions. We thought maybe if we give them this incremental learning curriculum, and I didn't quite get that I haven't figured out how to get that to work. Because I mean, I tried it and it still got stuck at some point. The agents got stuck, particularly because they had already converged on a particular set of intents. And then the ones that I was adding had lower likelihood, so they weren't as motivated to change their protocol in significant ways for intents that don't even occur with as much frequency, right? I mean, so I mean, certainly that was just like one instantiation of trying to do this idea of like evolving it. But it is something that I think is a really interesting idea, because I do think that learning is scaffolded in humans. And so it really kind of represents this, the curriculum learning is something that represents this idea of scaffolding the learning. And it's something I'd like to play with more, certainly. I mean, in particular, when I talk about the next step being in my, actually, you can't see this slide, but in my future work and the actual embodied part, which seems to be hard to get to. Here. When I say guiding the policy search to more robustly find a global optimum, one of the things I'm thinking about is like curriculum learning for this. So yeah, so it makes a lot of sense. But it is tricky because there are many different curriculums one could use, and trying to think about how best to kind of implement a curriculum learning algorithm is certainly, but in multi-agent literature, people are thinking about auto curricula. So certainly this is an interesting avenue.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Jack, do you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding from what was happening is we've got sort of a high dimensional space of motion, and we're mapping it to energies so that we can get to discrete communication concepts. And so I'm wondering if as the number of concepts we try to communicate grows, if we want to, if you might find it helpful to sort of move out of the energy space, because there's not like actually a limit, because the continuous space is very large, but I imagine in real world scenarios, you'd have to get like more and more precise with your motion so that you could make those, like keep the entropy down between actions. And I guess I'm wondering if N got really large, would agents have to learn similar motions, and then you wouldn't necessarily need to map to the energy itself. That also may not have made sense, but.
No. So your question about N getting really large and the energy may not necessarily be sufficient to represent kind of the variation is really, that's true. I mean, so actually I ended up testing up to like N equals 100, which that was just completely, completely failed because you have so many intents that have very similar likelihoods, like the last 80, that effectively it's really difficult to differentiate just based upon the energy feature, particularly because when you look at different agents, even if they got the correct ordering, they could still have different absolute values for what energy corresponds to a particular intent. And so, and if those absolute values or those energy values are quite close to each other, it would be easy to, misclassify what intent's being communicated. So I have started to think about the fact that the energy, is a very good place to start. I mean, you want to start simple. We wanted the minimal set of constraints, and certainly, I mean, that this is realistic in an embodied system like robots, for example, who have to think about resource consumption. But I don't think it's sufficient to capture kind of, larger, more realistic sets of communicative intents. I think, I mean, also there's other concerns with energy, like number one, I mean, it's not, it gets rid of a lot of the expressivity, which one of my collaborators who works in robotics was like, but I'm sad because that's part of the coolness of it. And it's like, yeah, I know, but let's just start with communication coordination. So the behaviors themselves become less interesting when you only look at this one dimension. And energy doesn't always correspond to the way we think about it if you want a natural protocol. So for example, if I were to do, let's say I do this and that, and like this versus that, right? If we're looking at an energy-based protocol, then this and this have the same label, then the really, but for humans, this one and then this one would have had the same label. So it would have been more about the shape feature. So it's not clear that energy is the best feature in the longer term, but it was certainly a good place to start the investigation, I think.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. Feel free to raise your hand or enter it in the chat. Okay, I think we can wrap it up then. So yeah, I request everyone to unmute themselves, and so we can thank the speaker once again. Yeah. Yeah. So Kalesha, I'll just stop the recording once.